Okay, welcome all. We should get started now. I'm Dean Chatterjee here in the Department of Philosophy. I'm in charge of the introduction here, and I have the distinct honor and the privilege and, of course, delight to present to you our distinguished panelists and especially our coveted lead presenter in this panel, Joel Rosenthal. And I need to tell you a bit about him. Joel Rosenthal, who is the president of Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Before I even tell you a bit about him, he is going to, the format of the panel is that he is going to give the lead presentation, followed by the other panelists who will be then taking their turns, and that will be followed by some good, robust time set for Q&A and discussion. So with that, we have deliberately set this panel for a longer time slot for 2 hours, rather than an hour and a half, to give everybody the ample time. So I will be telling you a bit about all of them, but especially about Joel Rosenthal, president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal titled Ethics and International Affairs, quite an influential journal in our profession and also for the real world, quote-unquote, for the policymakers and general publics and people in all professions. And he's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics at New York University, at NYU. Rosenthal is the author of Righteous Realist. The subtitle of that book is Political Realism, Responsible Power, and American Culture in the Nuclear Age. In fact, that subtitle, along with the title, says it all in terms of Rosenthal's focus, his efforts in promoting dialogue, making changes, bringing in change, initiating changes locally, nationally, and globally in all these important areas and bringing all of them together. He is also the co-editor of several anthologies and the author of numerous articles in both academic and popular journals. His scholarly work is multidisciplinary, equally pertinent to scholars in philosophy, policy, history, and public policy, as well as, of course, to general readers. And that's a very rare, unique combination and skill. Rosenthal is also a leading figure in promoting and facilitating discussion among scholars, policymakers, and the informed public on issues of social and global justice as the president of the council and also as a scholar and as a concerned citizen. Now, the council was founded on the vision of Andrew Carnegie in 1914 on the principles of peace, promoting peace and pluralism. And that's exactly what Rosenthal is doing in so many multidimensional fashion on so many fronts today, right now, in our divided and challenging world. His mission is to see that in our violent world we get to see minimizing, if not ending, of military conflict based on a vision of justice, human rights, dialogue, and accommodation. And along that line, in his scholarship as well as in his practice and in bringing all the different scholars and policymakers from all dimensions together at the council for discussion and all over the country, of course, to see how we can establish, think, talk, and sustain what he calls this pragmatic leadership. He has principles of leadership that he believes that today's leaders in the military, in politics, in academia, in business, in finance, they should be mindful of. And he has principles based on the issues of justice and human rights and inclusion and, of course, pluralism. And he calls his own idea along that line political realism, which is not just one-sided idea of self-interest in realism, not the extreme other side, which is total cosmopolitan globalism without any traction in the real world and in human nature, but he calls it a rich, nuanced mediation, a balanced view of the local and the global, the personal and the political, and of course it's based on the enhancement of the individual and the nation, their interests along with the interests of a pluralistic world. So with that, we are very glad to have Joel Rosenthal with us leading this discussion, and we will have our panelists. For the sake of brevity of time, I will not get into their detailed introduction. That's going to take time, but they are all well known amongst all of us, but I will just simply mention the names. They happen to be our Law College Dean, Hiram Chodosh, and then DeVon Hale from our University Professor of Internal Medicine. Then surely we have our Richard Miller, who gave the second keynote, Professor of Philosophy at Cornell, right here. Then we have Professor Polly Wiessner, Professor of Anthropology here at the EU. And so we should get going. We have 2 hours of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deen. When I was 15 years old, I took my first ethics class as a sophomore in high school. And my ethics teacher said at least one thing that remains with me till today. He said, look at your friends, and that's who you are. And to have Deen as a friend is really a privilege. I've learned a lot from you, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here and to be among this group. Several years ago, a friend of mine sent me an article. The title remains with me. It was called Hiding Out in the Fields of Learning. And this gentleman was in charge of putting together a core curriculum for a liberal arts college. And his concern was that research communities were becoming over-specialized. We had small groups of people talking to one another. How do we break through that? And that he saw too many intellectuals and academics hiding out. And I've been inspired to be here and to see this kind of activity going on. It's just a tremendous group effort, looking at the different disciplines that are represented here, also reaching out to the different schools in the area, and to see this kind of cooperation, collaboration, looking at these issues that are so important to teachers and students, but to publics, is really inspiring. And so I want to take this moment to add my thanks to Deen, to the Tanner Center, to the Tanner family, to Tom Maloney, to all the people. I know it's a long list if you look on the back of your brochure. It's just really amazing to see all the people who are part of this effort. As I was looking at the program for this afternoon, it occurred to me, I see that this could be sort of a setup for a joke. A lawyer, a doctor, a philosopher, and an anthropologist walk into a bar or an officers club or something like that. So I don't know if this is a setup or what the deal is, but we've had some good conversations leading up, so we'll see where it goes. As Deen said, I prepared a few remarks, which I hope will set sort of an agenda for at least this session, and perhaps will tie into some of the things that we've been discussing over the last few days. And then we'll have about 15 minutes from each of the panelists, and I hope we'll have some wrap-up time. Now, I'm acutely aware of the fact that speaking last or being on the last panel is both a burden and an opportunity. And I always think about that before I give a talk. I'm reminded of a saying that's attributed to Gandhi, who said, "Do not speak unless you can improve upon the silence." And there's a lot in that. So anytime you're preparing, sometimes I wish I should say that to my students too. Don't write unless unless you have something to say. So anyway, I've prepared these remarks with hoping to add some value. What I'd like to do is focus a little bit on the theme of the common good. And this might give us the opportunity to conclude this conference around a constructive theme, a theme that can be built upon in the various disciplines and subdisciplines and different professions that have been featured over these past 2 days. The concept of the common good is especially appealing to me because it is consistent with realism. By realism, I mean that actors act according to their interests as a matter of both survival and well-being. Human flourishing implies natural tendencies towards self-help, as well as the care towards others whose lives are bound up with ours. This idea, the idea that our self-interests are always bound in some way to the interests of others, takes on a new dimension in the age of globalization. As we have discussed in great detail, the crisis of globalization means that we live in global systems that are gaining in speed and intensity. Our most basic needs, jobs, health, security, are now fully embedded in global systems that shape our lives. The language of the common good implies that we have common interests. From an ethical perspective, this observation should remind us of Adam Smith's emphasis on mutuality. There's some irony in the fact that Smith is best known for his description of mercantilism and the accumulation of capital in the wealth of nations. Many contemporary theorists miss the fact that modern economics was founded as a moral discipline. Economics, according to Smith, was to be a moral science devoted to normative issues, not a dismal science limited to empirical calculation. I would submit that Smith's most important contribution came in the first paragraph of his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In this first paragraph, we have the father of the discipline that gave us empirical terms like maximizing utility and rational choice modeling, beginning his entire enterprise with the normative idea of sympathy. If you will indulge me, I will read to you the first paragraph of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Chapter 1 of Sympathy, and this is Smith. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others, when we either see it or are made to conceive of it. When we either see it or are made to conceive of it in a lively manner. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrow of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instances to prove it. For this sentiment, like all other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtuous and humane, though they may feel it with more exquisite sensibility. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it. End of quote. In plain terms, the first thing we need to understand is that sympathy, empathy, and mutuality are the foundation of human society. We cannot understand our own interests unless we understand the interests of others. If we take seriously that global systems have more impact on our lives than ever before, then we must also take seriously that our rights and responsibilities vis-a-vis others must be evolving as well. To use Michael Walzer's terms, thick and thin relations are not as self-evident as they once were. Not long ago, we could be content in thinking that the community most relevant to our lives was clearly bounded. Our thick community would be delineated by those with whom we shared history, language, culture, and interacted with on a daily basis. Our thin relationships were straightforward as well. We understood that distant strangers had relatively little bearing on our identity and our sense of responsibility. Today, globalization has not erased these lines, but it has blurred them in some serious ways. In today's world, it is clear that global systems have created global-level problems that require global-level solutions. Two questions arise from this observation. First, if global problems do indeed require global solutions, does it then follow that global solutions require global institutions? And second, do global solutions, however they are configured, depend on a foundation of a global ethic? As for global institutions, in my view, new institutions may be useful in some circumstances, but I do not believe that they are the only or sometimes even the best answer to specific problems we are trying to address. In his book, Global Civics, Hakan Altani points out that on occasion, the institutional approach yields good results. We see that creative and innovative new institutions sometimes do make a difference. He specifically mentions the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, and an interesting one, the Internet Corporation for the Assignment of Names and Numbers, ICANN, which coordinates the World Wide Web, creates norms and standards. These organizations are global in scope, even if they are not international organizations at the level of the UN and its specialized agencies. Altani also mentions a second non-institutional approach to global governance, which he calls commensurability. Here the focus is on attaining agreement on standards for global governance, rather than on creating new institutions. We can imagine a variety of issue areas such as finance, climate, migration, or crime, where parties would agree to uphold certain standards within their jurisdiction, thereby addressing an issue of global magnitude by synchronizing their response with others. Both institutionalism and commensurability point us inexorably toward the question of global ethics. That is, can we and do we find common values upon which to address our common interests? Altani and others suggest that we do. And for him, global civics is the process by which we discuss and decide our rights and responsibilities in this new world in which we find ourselves. Traditional civics affords us the opportunity to determine the rights and responsibilities arising out of the social contract in a nation. Global civics does the same in a larger context. Now, in a recent lecture at the Carnegie Council, Michael Ignatieff launched the Carnegie Council's centennial theme of reimagining a global ethic with the following, and I quote Michael Ignatieff: "I really want to start by asking the simplest question of all, which is, should we be speaking of a global ethic in the singular or global ethics in the plural? Why not start with the most obvious question of all? I start by saying, and I'm still quoting here, I start by saying that a global ethic in the singular, a perspective that takes all human beings and their habitat as its subject, does exist. It's doing very well, and it's flourishing in academic philosophy departments around the world. Its function is to lay bare the ethical presuppositions that underlie injustice and inequality in a globalized world. It is a critical tool. Its purpose is political, to expose what is unfair and unjust in our world and expose that from an ideal vantage point, and then to devise an ideal distribution of resources and responsibilities that would make our world fairer. That seems like a very good idea to me." End of that quote. However, as a realist and a pluralist, Ignatieff warns against a simple, singular approach to the global ethic as a form of global justice, and I quote Ignatieff again. "One of the chimeras or illusions to focus on when we think about a global ethic is the risk of our seeing the global ethic as a non-contradictory set of goods. I just don't think a global ethic can possibly be a non-contradictory set of goods. because I think there's a substantial conflict between democracy and justice, between the self-determination of communities and what we owe abstractly in terms of justice to individuals. So if a global ethic cannot be non-self-contradictory, what is it good for? What can we use it for? Here I would say that it is an ethical perspective that allows us to get up above the view from somewhere in particular. It gives us an ideal perspective, and it becomes not a doctrine, but a site of argument, end of quote. Ignatieff, like Altani, sees the common good as something that must be forged out of a global debate over sometimes converging and sometimes diverging values and interests. Convergence cannot be assumed as a given. While we may be able to point to universal agreements on certain rights, implementation of those rights is often controversial. As Ignatieff and Altani remind us, we need a process of encounter between universal claims and particular circumstances. There is no one size to fit all. As the process of globalization continues to gain strength, there is a growing debate over the relationship between the national and the global. Danny Roderick makes an important contribution to this debate by reminding us, like Ignatieff, that hyperglobalization and democracy are not always compatible. He suggests that the best way to manage the inevitable tension between universal principles and realities on the ground is to create, quote, a thin layer of international rules that leaves substantial room for maneuver by national governments, end of quote. In the forthcoming issue of our journal, Ethics in International Affairs, David Roden echoes this point. He argues that global issues require coordinated action at the international, regional, national, and indeed individual level. Using the example of climate change, he explains that, quote, ancillary action will be required by numerous actors who are not themselves party to international agreements and whose responsibilities cannot be fully specified there. These actors will include regional groupings of states, municipal and local authorities, civil society groups, and individuals. Unless action is taken across all these domains, the problem of global warming is likely to be unresolved, end of quote. Therefore, according to Roden, an issue like climate change must be addressed through differing combinations of the global and the local. The point of global ethics is not that the management of global issues should always be pushed up toward the global mechanisms. The point is rather that identifying the right balance between global and local responsibilities is itself a key function of global ethics. Now, Roden's and Roderick's remarks flag my concern that the global justice agenda, if not properly contextualized as a political force, will become marginalized as a utopian ideology. Many of you will remember Michael Ignatieff's essay of 10 years ago titled Human Rights as Idolatry. It's not hard to imagine a follow-up along these lines today, called Global Justice as Idolatry. In brief, we have to be careful in prescribing the common good to others. Because there are multiple views of the good life, in my view, we are better off thinking about moral minimums than moral maximums. And when it comes to deciding on what we should insist upon as the basic common good, this notion has to be worked out by the actors themselves, based on what can be achieved on the ground. It will be of no use to invoke transcendental arguments based on religious faith or even secular notions of the sacred. In fact, arguments of this type are likely to be counterproductive. I think it is important to confront this idea of utopianism, and I hope we can get to this in this session. Samuel Moyn's new book, The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, frames the issue nicely for us. Moyn reminds us of the problematic aspects of the universalism of human rights. The contemporary human rights movement, says Moyn, is in danger of becoming what he calls, quote, a recipe for the displacement of politics, forcing aspirations for change to present themselves as less controversial than they really are, end of quote. Human rights, in other words, is becoming a universal language that masks and encapsulates a particular ideology, and I think we need to be honest about this. Citing Henry Steiner, Moyne mentions the two missions that the human rights movement has been, quote, apt to confuse. The first is human rights as catastrophe prevention. The second is human rights as utopian politics. By utopian politics, he means the fulfillment of the range of positive rights as mentioned in various declarations and manifestos. Moyne argues that today these goals, quote, preventing catastrophe prevention through minimalist ethical norms and building utopia through maximalist political vision are absolutely different. I'm quoting Moyne here. One, catastrophe prevention, remains consistent with the moralized breakthrough of human rights in the first place. The other, pursuing a political vision, follows from aspirations human rights have incorporated since then, aspirations that are emphatically visionary, but also necessarily divisive, end of quote. So Moyne comes out on the minimalist side. He refers to the need to, quote, make room for the contest of genuinely political visions for the future, end of quote, and to acknowledge that humanity is still confused about how to bring about individual and collective freedom in a deeply unjust world. Now, even if you disagree with his conclusion, Moyne's work is very helpful in encouraging deep reflection on the ideology and assumptions contained within the modern human rights movement. The relationship of that movement to the growing community of scholars and activists in the global justice field bears some consideration as well. With this challenge in mind, I think of global justice and the common good along the lines of what Jay Winter calls minor utopias. In his book, Jay Winter's book, Dreams of Peace and Freedom, Utopian Moments in the 20th Century, Winter writes of minor utopias, or moments of possibility, when new ideas moved from the margin to the center of public life, each suggesting a better future on a global scale. Examples include 1919, when self-determination came into its own, 1948, when human rights became a recognized international norm, 1968, when the idea of liberation launched student movements around the world, and 1992, when the concept of global citizenship gained notoriety in a variety of international forums. Each moment of possibility introduced a new principle to be reckoned with. Each changed the way the world was understood. Winter distinguishes these moments of minor utopia from major utopia. Major utopias are singular in nature. They have blueprints. They imagine an end state that is directed and managed by a central authority. The 20th century had its share of major utopia projects. Hitler, Stalin, Mao. Each had a project of state-centered social engineering which turned into a nightmare. Minor utopias are different in intent, scale, and process. Minor utopias suggest a direction, not an end state. They do not suggest ultimate answers or an end to social conflicts over first principles. I would suggest that the establishment of the common good in the 21st century will depend on forging common interests around issues of global concern. The approach is likely to be most successful if it is functional, based on needs and possibilities for cooperative, non-zero outcomes, always keeping in mind that interests are becoming increasingly intertwined and that our interests are bound up in the interests of others. In those areas where it is not possible to agree on what is good, perhaps we can at least try to forge agreement on what is bad and what is to be avoided. Universal aspirations for freedom and dignity are having a new moment right now. From the Arab Spring to the Occupy movements around the world, there is a global sense that accountability matters and social justice remains a potent political force. So as we remember the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the American Civil War, and we close in on the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I, there is good reason to believe that the quest for the common good can be pursued in more peacefully and with less violence than in the past. But of course, there are no guarantees, and what happens will be very much up to us. So that concludes my remarks. I hope that this is a nice setup for our panelists, who I know will be taking more of a ground-up view of this idea of the common good. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Richard, and we're just going to go in order right down the table. So Richard, thank you all for your attention.
Is this okay? Close it? Okay. Well, in a way, I'm going to mirror Joel. There is no prearrangement. This is just one of those spontaneous harmonies, because I am going to be talking about the diversity that our conferences reveal, diversity in sources of responsibility, diversity in opportunities to help, sometimes by fulfilling responsibilities. But I also want to talk about a problem that raises, a problem of focus in the face of such diversity. So that is very much the structure of Joel's presentation of our challenge, our dilemma, but I think the diversity is going to be of a different kind, and the focus is going to be of a different kind, and then we'll see whether this is the kind of difference that amounts to disagreement. First, I've been very impressed by the diversity of sources of transnational responsibility, morally speaking, that the conference has revealed. Finally, in this morning's first panel, I think our eyes were opened to the importance of a duty of general beneficence that we have. We were talking about moral problems of what one of the panelists called the assistance industry. And I think the assistance industry, in its moral presuppositions, is based on something that's right. That just in virtue of the fact that there are very needy people in the world, whereas other people have the capacity to help them, those other people do have responsibilities to help. Responsibilities to help, and I would say enforceable responsibilities to help. You know, Robinson Crusoe walks down to the dock. He's carrying the boat hook that he's going to use to get his rowboat to take his nightly row to the edge of the lagoon where the sunset is especially beautiful, and Friday Jr. is drowning and will drown unless that boat hook is used. Friday may wrest that boat hook from Crusoe's hand to save his drowning son. I think that's as sure as any moral datum. It tells us not just that a failure to assist can be wrong, but that preventing that failure by the use of force can be morally justifiable. Some would say a duty. So yeah, there are enforceable duties to help, for example, via taxation. And I don't think we should despair of foreign aid in general, making no difference. The best studies of the most studied aspect, the contribution of development aid to growth, suggests that on average, foreign aid does make a difference with diminishing returns, diminishing to nothing at the maximum, the current maximum of aid dependence. I don't think anybody thinks that the people of Haiti would be better off if there hadn't been a rush in of aid from international agencies, despite the chaos, despite the resentment, despite the limitations of that aid. Moreover, I think we're kidding ourselves if we tell ourselves that limitations of foreign aid are limits of our duty
to assist. There are lots of other ways to help. You can help by opening the gates to more immigration of unskilled people from poor countries. You can help by letting more imported goods in. You can help by taking on more burdens in the response to the greenhouse challenge. But I do think that the duty of general beneficence is limited. It's limited in its demands. I think we all have a duty to be so concerned for neediness as such that a deeper level of concern would make our lives significantly worse. But I don't think we have any more demanding duty just on account of neediness. That's one reason why I don't think my wife and I did wrong when we paid for our daughter going to a good liberal arts college. The money that we spent, money spent just on making her life better, not on preventing her life from being bad, could have saved 5 or 6 kids from in Mali, statistically speaking, from death before the age of 5, from infectious diseases. We didn't do anything wrong because that was a task of keeping the life of somebody who was our intimate dependent from becoming worse than it had to be. And of course, one is oneself, one's own most intimate dependent. Now, these limitations can be overcome to some extent by looking to duties that are created from the fact that you've taken part in the coercive shaping of others' lives, right? That's modeled on your relation to your fellow citizens whose lives you shape via political coercion. And that was raised, for example, in one of yesterday's impressive panels. And I think that that's tremendously important. There too, though, one has to pay attention to specificity and to diversity. It seems to me even when coercion is involved, the extent of the responsibility that's created depends on the sphere of life that's shaped. It depends on the interests in self-reliance and in association that limit the just demands to take from some and give to others. It depends on the structure of benefit and burden and pre-existing rights that bind that specific relationship. And that's an important limitation. A coercion won't do it by itself. Depends on the kind of coercion. Zaire was in effect coerced in cooperating with the rules on check clearing that are administered by a council of central banks that meets in Basel, Switzerland. They had no choice. You have to conform or your checks don't clear across national lines. That did not create an obligation of the governments that were represented by those bankers to lift the people of Zaire from poverty. The U.S. sponsoring Mobutu, the main villain of that abysmal poverty, that created an obligation. Mere participation in a coercive process didn't because of the relationship of that process to that suffering. Moreover, coercion isn't the whole story of duties of transnational responsibility that go beyond duties of beneficence, duties of aid. Fairness counts independently. There is coercion that goes on in international arrangements, for example, in the WTO arrangements governing world trade. But look, even if countries weren't coerced into joining in the WTO through threats primarily by the United States to deny them access to markets if they don't cooperate, still it would be fundamentally important for WTO relations to be fair, to be terms of cooperation that benefit all to some extent and divide the net benefits to everyone of cooperation fairly. So we've got utmost diversity, but I think we have a moral that we can use if we look for focus. It looks as if this perspective that's going to tell us where the crucial transnational responsibilities are is going to be a perspective that will look to the specific nature of current international relations and sometimes make empirically controversial claims. Here's another kind of diversity that we've encountered. We've encountered in the course of the conference diversity among the kinds of agents taking part in transnational processes that can help, and sometimes we've encountered diversity in responsibility, that's diversity in responsibility attaching to specific agents. This morning we heard, for example, about the special opportunities, the special challenges, the special responsibility of people in the assistance industry. And then we heard about the special challenges and perhaps the special responsibilities of people in a social movement, the international feminist movement. They were of very different kinds. One thing that we heard about on both panels, though, is, I think, a further clue in our search for focus. In both panels, we heard about a setting of the context for the work of these specialists, which often was more important in producing problems than any solution that these specialists could come up with in their own specialist activity. Remember how Ken, for example, describing his admirable, innovative, creative work, my words, but the admiration seized me as I followed his talk. In Nepal also is very clear that the process of urbanization in India set the terms of what he was doing and limited his opportunity, a process of urbanization largely steered by the Indian government, though to some extent by international financial institutions, certainly not by the people he was serving or the doctors and aid agency people he was working with. We also heard about how what can be done to prevent differential abortion of girls in India was limited by what GE does and what the Indian government does not do in the way of managing the impact of technology that's a vehicle for the differential abortion rate. Okay, so another model, anything that we say about the needed focus is going to involve a certain division of labor, and it's going to be addressed to people at one point in the division of labor. Got about 5 minutes to go? Okay, now I'd like to make my pitch for that very limited focus. It's going to be quite specific to a certain position in a moral division of labor, but I think it's going to have the virtue of being about everyone or nearly everyone in this room. It seems to me that for somebody in the United States, outside of the corridors of power, the main focus in trying to get unmet transnational responsibilities met is going to be the exposure of and correction of destructive tendencies of U.S. foreign policy. Remember what I said about the division of labor? I don't think this is the main responsibility for someone in Zimbabwe or China. There are people who are specialists and people in the corridors of power who do and should be doing different things. But it seems to me one moral from our panels, for example, our panel this morning, is that actions of governments, above all then of the mightiest government in the world, have a powerful effect, and I would say an often destructive effect, on the realization of transnational responsibilities, generate new responsibilities to make good. I'll just quickly mention the problems generating responsibilities that came up this morning. First, there were humanitarian problems. For example, the hunger crisis in Somalia. The hunger crisis in Somalia exists because in 2007, the United States urged on Ethiopia, our main military client in the Horn of Africa, to invade Somalia and dismantle the first government that had restored basic order to Somalia in over a decade, because it was a government of an Islamicist movement with a moderate leadership, though a radical fringe, that was going to take an important part of the vital Red Sea coast out of the sphere of American power. The most horrible humanitarian crisis in our time has been the crisis in the eastern Congo, involving over 3 million excess deaths. That crisis in the eastern Congo, of course, had horrible people sometimes acting against the interests of the United States, like Robert Mugabe as some of its agents. But it was a crisis that claimed millions rather than tens and hundreds of thousands because of the utter breakdown of sources of order, of resilience and self-help through the regime of Mobutu, the super horrible tyrant who we had restored. And it was fueled by transnational corporations buying the pillage. For example, the mineral pillage of those marauding armies, transnational corporations who were protected in that process in the face of challenges, primarily by the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom. In Haiti, an earthquake was going to hurt as it hurts even in advanced countries at that scale, but the absence of a functioning state is the reason why people suffer miserably to this day. That state failure in a country whose governance is shaped by the United States, whose direct origin was the U.S. undermining, helping to destroy the Aristide government when Aristide did not do the bidding of the United States after being installed. We also heard about climate change this morning. And let me offer you that although what Andrew said was an important argument for the shape of justice in climate change, I think the main barrier to realizing an effective climate change regime, which in order to be acceptable to China and India will have to be fair in the way that Andrew was pointing at, is the U.S.-China rivalry, is the U.S. project of maintaining U.S. preeminence for as long as possible. In the face of that rivalry, George W. Bush didn't base his rejection of Kyoto on junk science. He said Kyoto should be rejected because it didn't restrict China and India. Barack Obama's climate representative excuses the U.S. for doing nothing effective to bring about replacement of the Kyoto Accord on the grounds that greedy China is getting in the way. It seems to me that the main barrier to saving the planet from severe climate harms by the end of the century is the impulse of the U.S. government to postpone the overtaking of the U.S. by China for as long as possible, because a fair climate change regime would inevitably do that. So as one part of a vast division of labor, I would urge you to consider whether the destructive tendencies of U.S. foreign policy in the effort to preserve U.S. preeminence for as long as possible aren't a major source of unmet responsibilities and a very high obstacle to meeting unmet responsibilities, some of which come from elsewhere, for example, from our duty of general beneficence. If you agree that they are, well, it seems to me that because of the enormous weight of U.S. politics and of U.S. education, at least through secondary school, and of the U.S. media posed against this sort of exposure, I hope, if you agree with me, then you will also agree that taking part in this sort of exposure of U.S. foreign policy will be a way in which you can help to realize the dreams of this conference to some extent, just reducing the mass of unmet responsibilities. That's how the Vietnam War ended. Johnson's Senior Advisory Council said, we can win this militarily. It's not worth tearing apart the country. That's how the Doha round was prevented from making things even worse than the Uruguay round that produced the WTO because of demonstrations against the WTO regime that alerted people to its limitations, created a much better audience for economists who are aware of its limitations. That's the little bit that we can do as a hopeful part of global social movements, which I sort of hope are a precursor to a better world generations hence, in which international relations are based on genuine international cooperation. Thanks.
It's been a great opportunity for me to be part of this this conference. It's a far cry from most of the conferences that I go to. There are a fair number of ideas that I have never even dwelled upon that have been proposed and discussed here. So I hope then that my presentation will not be so far abreast from what we've talked about that it will be that it will not fit. I thought I'd talk a little bit about medicine and some of the human rights that go along with medicine. So in 1978, there was a meeting in Russia at the Alma-Ata conference where they made a declaration with regards to health and health rights in the world. That conference then made this declaration. The conference strongly reaffirms that health, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, is a fundamental human right, and that the attainment of the highest possible level of health is a most important worldwide social goal whose realization requires the action of many other social and economic sectors in addition to the health sector. This the proposal that this then is a human right was done by obviously a group of optimists, because not only did they propose this, but they proposed to accomplish this by the year 2000. Impossible. I think none of these people had ever been to Africa. They further defined what they meant by interventions that would provide this health condition, and they called it primary health care. Primary health care to me means that I go to my primary health care physician. This is their definition. Their definition includes other things, but these were the important things. Education concerning prevailing health problems and the methods of preventing and controlling them. Promotion of food supply and proper nutrition. An adequate supply of safe water and basic sanitation, maternal and child health care, including family planning, immunization against the major infectious diseases, prevention and control of locally endemic diseases, appropriate treatment of common diseases and injuries, and provision of essential drugs. Now, that even makes them more optimists, because they have expanded this definition of right to health care to a number of conditions that obviously affect health care, but to accomplish that in a mere 22 years, again, almost impossible. So at the year 2000, they had failed, obviously. By the year 2008, the head of the WHO talked about their failure and mentioned some of the progress that has been made, and there has been progress made, but very meager progress compared to the goals that they had set. So they set a new goal. They set a new goal that, all right, if we didn't make it by 2000, let's make this by 2015. Well, we're 3 years away from that. How do you think we're doing now? Not so good. There are a couple of brighter stars, however. So China looks like they may be in a position that they could accomplish this. And India, a maybe. But if you look at the progress that Africa has made in this last 12 years, The estimate is that it would take 150 more years to accomplish what they would like to have done here with regards to rights of health and well-being. So how do we make a difference? How could we accomplish this? It obviously takes, as they stated, that it takes a number of other areas besides medicine to accomplish this. And this just can't be done by some of the ways that we've tried. So this could not be done by a group of physicians pooling their resources, gathering a few medications, and appearing at a rural village somewhere in the world and opening up a clinic for 3 days. What do you think that contribution makes to this overall goal? Almost nothing. And yet we continue to do those kind of things that make great experiences for us. Sometimes we help on an individual basis, but to accomplish an overall goal, not much of a benefit. So what would help? Well, obviously other things. So governments help. I was so pleased and surprised when President Bush announced that he was setting aside $15 million for the PEPFAR fund to diagnose and treat AIDS in Africa. What a fantastic thing that was. What a surprise it was. That combined with other monies has saved millions of lives and essentially is beginning to turn around this scourge that we've endured from HIV. So government has a place. Not only governments of donor countries, but governments of countries without much resources. So Ghana, for example, when we first went to Ghana in 2001, they were spending about $2 per person for health care, and most of that was for immunizations. About 4 or 5 years ago, they put together a health plan that is a little embarrassing to us. So their health plan provides free care for all children under 5, free health care for all pregnant women, and free health care for all persons over age 60. Now, others then can pay to be part of this health care plan, but for those specific groups, those are areas where the health care can make a bigger dent and more progress. So governments not only of donor countries but receiving make a difference. Economic progress. You look at what China's done. What China's done is that because of a group of medical decisions? Not necessarily. That may be more economic than anything else. If you look at the progress of healthcare in countries, it continues to improve almost on a straight line until you get to a GDP of approximately $5,000. And at that point, then it kind of tapers off. So that economically, people who are countries that then become better economically also progress medically. Now there are other things. There are NGOs that can participate. There are a number of other good people in the world that are trying to make a difference with regards to health care. But one of those could be universities. Universities have a great advantage. We usually don't have a political agenda. We don't have necessarily a business agenda. We have essentially, or we can have, if we focus on it, an educational agenda. That's kind of what we do. We teach. And we can teach here, and we can teach in developing countries. So that kind of is where we landed about 12 years ago, maybe 14 years ago. So in 1998, we recognized that throughout the 90s, our medical students that were coming to medical school had a great desire to do some type of an international program, and many of them had already done that before arriving in medical school. We looked at what was happening once they arrived in medical school and found that many of them were participating in international programs. Not only that, but when we looked at our postgraduate trainees, our residents, and our faculty, many of them were involved in diverse international type activities. When we looked at this and saw the huge amount of energy and effort that was taking place with people in our school, we felt that we might be able to take that energy and focus it on 3 or 4 or 5 areas of long-term relationships where we could make a much more impactful difference than what we were doing with this diffuse program. So we tried that. We first looked around and tried to evaluate what other medical schools were doing because we were a little late in getting into this. There are a lot of medical schools that have been involved with this for many years. And there were a number of things that we concluded as we started out. One of them was that educational exchange is the least expensive and has the chance of being the most beneficial to participants of both the visiting and the host institutions. And this again fits with what we do. We learn, we teach, and we can do that here and we can do that at other sites. The second thing was that those that seemed successful had permanent long-term commitments. This is not something that you go in and do overnight and leave. The longer the commitment, the better chance that we have to benefit and the better chance they have to benefit. The third was that an educational, as we develop, we can go in with an educational mission, but our other responsibilities at the university are service and research, and that develops. If we start out with education and we make friends with our colleagues, before long we have things that develop where we can do research, where we can do combine service with them. So those are the things that we tried to do as we started out developing some things, and we went in with nothing. When we go to these, we've set up now 5 sites where we have long-term relationships. When we went to these sites, we went with no money, with no supplies, with no equipment, and it was fantastic to find that the people then that we met that were interested in what we were doing were also interested in education and not in our money and not in our supplies and not in our resources. That then provides a fantastic base to develop friendship and collegial relationships. So what happened? Our most developed site is in Ghana. We have, last year we had 51 faculty members go and teach in Ghana. We had 31 postdoctoral trainees or residents that also participated in that activity, and 64 students. Now the students were not all medical students. There were public health students, nursing students, pharmacy students, physician assistant students, and a few undergraduates. So this then focused a fair amount of effort and educational activity at one site, and it seemed to make a difference. We hoped it made a difference. And if you looked at what we do, we divided our what we did into 2 things. One was the clinical activities and the other was public health. So our clinical activities, we went and taught in programs that were already in place there. So they had internal medicine and pediatrics and OBGYN, and our faculty then taught and learned from their people. But in addition to that, they were at a point where they were ready to start new training programs. And over the past 12 years, they have begun training programs in anesthesia, ophthalmology, pathology, orthopedics, emergency medicine, family medicine. They started a new dental school, and they expanded their physician assistant program. Our people then have supported them as they develop these programs. Again, it's their program. We then have the ability to support and expand what they're trying to do. In our public health program, we're involved in 22 villages or communities. That's a small pittance. There are 22,000 small communities in Ghana. So our goal there was to try and identify ways that we could work in those villages or communities that would then be transferable to other communities, either through other agencies or through the government. So we looked at different things. We looked at the evaluation of malaria. We looked at bed net use. So in 2005, we did an evaluation of people who were using bed nets for their children under 5. We had 3% of those that had bed nets, and none of them had used them the previous night. In 2009, we went back. This was after a huge government program. 89% of them had bed nets, and 89% of those who had them used them the previous night. And our students went in and looked to see if the bed net was hanging, and it was, as if it had been used. So those are the kind of things we do in the village. Other things, we did an evaluation and reinforcement of the utilization of oral rehydration fluids. So children under 5, malaria is the biggest killer in Ghana, but diarrheal disease is also a big killer. And to have oral rehydration fluids administered early in a diarrheal disease saves lives. We found a great deficiency in this area among the villages and felt like this was an area where we could help educate and teach. The value of safe water, in our main village, they had a standpipe from a water treatment plant, and we looked at that water and it was good water. The biggest problem was they charged for it. This was a government treatment plant. They couldn't afford to give this to these people free. It cost them 2 cents to get 3 gallons of water. When we first started there, almost nobody used that. With time and education and help them understanding what a benefit that was, a very large majority of them are now using this standpipe for their drinking water. And interestingly enough, 2 cents per gallon is more expensive than what I pay per gallon of water at my home. So interesting. We upgraded their sewage facility. We put a lot of money into that. We probably wouldn't do that again. That probably wouldn't work very, very often in Ghana. We helped build a school, again, helped them attract teachers, but didn't change a whole lot. We did a verbal autopsy study of children who had died in the last 5 years under 5 with regards to what the symptoms they had, what we hoped to identify the cause was, but more important, what was the barrier? So in some parts of Ghana, 80% of the children under 5 die without any kind of medical contact. What are the barriers? And what could we do to provide something that would identify these people at risk and allow them to be treated? And then finally, an agricultural project. So the village came and said, you know, we need better cash flow. That was 7 years ago. It took us, we evaluated to see what might work, and they wanted to range oranges, and so we went to the agricultural department of the university there, and they did a feasibility study, and they said, well, maybe this will work, so we tried. It took us 4 years for us to help them get a bank loan to do their orange grove. Now, we could have gotten the money for that orange grove easily with just a few donors. But teaching them how to organize and prepare and finance an orange grove was something that was very new for subsistence farmers. And we learned a lot and they learned a lot. Now then, if you look at what's happened, if you look at the interaction that we've had that has hopefully contributed to developing capacity, to improving training and supply of medical care providers. If you look at village things like creating awareness of illness, access to medical care, utilization of water, hygiene and toilet facilities, improved nutrition, it sounds a lot like the primary health care definition by the WHO. That's what we hope makes a difference. We hope that what we do will make a little bigger difference to the things that they're trying to do. So, and then for us, this is a fantastic experience. For our people to go there, What an opportunity. What an opportunity to learn from them. What an opportunity to learn how to try and provide medical care in a setting with limited resources. For us, this activity promotes not only health care education, but cultural awareness and helps us understand that we are part of the world. Thank you.
Now I've got the microphone. Okay, I'm going to start off with a conversation that I had with an old man in Enga in Papua New Guinea named Ambom Mati. He's a well-known peacemaker for many years in Enga, and he began peacemaking in traditional fights where people come out, they had a bone to pick, they'd fight with bow and arrows, 2 or 3 people would be killed, they'd exchange pigs, and it would be over. And I used to go with my lunch to these wars and have a look. And then in 1990, the M16 came into tribal fighting, and that changed the picture. No one goes to have a look anymore. So I started off with him by bringing him a Coke, because you have no caffeine and no sugar in the daily diet in Enga. He's a really old man, and drinking 1 Coke gives a very energized conversation. So the first thing he did is he took a leaf and he put it down carefully, arranged it with leaves and ferns, and he put it down, and he converted to Catholicism. He crossed himself, he said a prayer. And I looked at him and I said, Ambon, why are you doing that? It's only a Coke. And he got a glint in his eye, he picked up the can, he popped the top, it went psht. He said, see, the Holy Spirit is in there. And then we began to have our interview, and I began to bemoan the war in Enga with the M16s, the whole Lai Valley. 30,000 people had fled as refugees. They had burned the hospitals, the high schools, everything was burned to the ground. And I said, Ambon, why are your people doing this? What's going on here? And he looked at me and he said, yesterday, I went down to town to get medicine, and I have an educated son who has a house there with a TV. And even though I don't speak English, I just decided to watch the TV. Seems to me that your people also have a war going on. He obviously had seen a film of Iraq. And I said, yeah. And he said, pretty bad one, isn't it? I said, yes, it is. He said, do you think that's where our guns are coming from? And I said, well, the guns you're using are made for wars like this, yes. He said, and then I saw something else that amazed me. He said, I saw a program on TV showing that your people are eating themselves to death. And I realized that he must have seen something on obesity. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, how does that work? Do some people take all the food? Don't they see that other people are hungry too? And I said, well, that's not how it works. In our country, we have much too much food, so everybody can have all they want. And then he looked even more puzzled, and he said, but when their stomachs are full, what are they filling up? And I was just rather speechless, but he pressed me on this. He wouldn't let me go. He said, what are they filling up when they filled their stomachs? And then I realized I'm quite used to this now, because when I started as an anthropologist, my job was to explain them to us. And now in the world, more and more, it's to explain us to them. So I gave a shot at it, and I explained the breakdown of kinship, how lonely many people are, and maybe they're filling up their loneliness. I also talked about work and stress, and maybe that's what was going on. And I don't know what he thought of it. He just said, hey. So I'd like to a bit unpack my conversation with Ambon. Let's see, this was maybe I'm meant to go on a slide. Yeah, so this is a picture of modern war. These are guys I met on the road, and they were obviously really happy to ham it up for me. So let's unpack this. Throughout the 20th century in anthropology, and when I went through graduate school, we were told that we had to record everything because everything would change, be gone, and all people would become like us as soon as people began to see the cash, the clothing. And when you travel, you often feel this is happening. So the number one interpretation of the Coke can would be that capitalism has arrived in Papua New Guinea, and Papua New Guinea has two levels of sort of colonization, first by the missions and now by capitalism. And with the arrival of Coke, traditional values and Christian values have gone off with the Holy Spirit, and money is life is what rules today. That would be the interpretation we would make from the outside. But this is, in fact, not what we're seeing at all. What we're seeing is that cultures are not changing so that people become like us, but they are indigenizing the new or the modern. Let me give you an example here. This was I was supposed to show with food sharing. This would be Ambon's idea of one person taking it all rather than sharing. This is the way the Enga would eat together. Okay, so what's happened is Coke has come in and it has replaced sugarcane. Sugarcane is very hard to grow in Enga. It takes a long time. And with more people, increasing population, it's hard to grow enough. Sugarcane is an emblem of civility and hospitality. So any event where you come for a marriage, to make peace, to get together, you have to give sugarcane. So people have sort of capitalized on the fact that they have this new, cheaper product. And this can be seen. This is a picture I saw that the Enga drew on a wall, and this emblemizes this fellow's chewing sugarcane and the Coke's next to him. And then there's a cassowary and a soccer ball. I don't know why. But the Coke is much more efficient, and down below you can see the cases of Coke distributed before a feast. So really what they've done is they've appropriated Coke into their culture. It takes on a completely different meaning. Yesterday from Yam we heard of cell phones in toilet seats. And if you see a picture of someone using a cell phone in New Guinea or Africa and you think they're making $1 a day or you know what they're using it for, I can assure you, you don't. I could spend an hour talking on the different uses of cell phones as they become indigenized. And even toilet seats. You think, if you see a toilet seat being exported, you know what it's going to be used for. But in fact, if you take a toilet seat and you wrap it with plastic flowers, it makes a beautiful grave decoration. I couldn't find my, oops, no, oh, okay, this is, I have to go forward one and then back. Yeah, these aren't toilet seats, but I've seen graves with toilet seats used for this purpose. So then again, they're appropriating our stuff for them. And going back one, even cash in Enga comes in and it circulates in traditional bride wealth, compensation, funeral feasts, payments. It's put up on poles, it's paraded. And a lot of this cash never reaches the trade stores unless someone's desperate. It's taken home, put in a box, buried for the next ceremonial event. So those are, okay, that's kind of frivolous stuff. But I want to talk about now how items are taken in and indigenized. And the one I've been working with is the gun. People essentially adopted the gun into tribal fighting in 1990, and 550 wars were fought in a population of 300,000 by 2008. The whole place was burned, there were refugees, everybody was miserable. People realized that this was not something to replace the bow and arrow, and they began to turn to meet their local mediators for peace. So rather than going to war over problems, they sought mediation. And when the gun was adopted, the youth got control. And then after some years, when everybody was fed up, the elders got control. These are the mediators coming in. These are uneducated people, they're untrained local leaders. And these people, when I came home in November, there had not been a tribal war in 2010 and 2011. So they had actually, through indigenous institutions of mediation and restorative justice, brought about peace. I'd like to give you one settlement they made so you can get a feeling of what it's like. There was a woman whose husband abused her badly. He destroyed her possessions. Her child died. He didn't pay the necessary payment to show the sorrow to her kin. She ran off to the city, got pregnant with another man, and died in childbirth. When she died, there was fury in the clans, and people were ready to go to war. And these guys heard this on their cell phone. They piled into a vehicle. They went to the spot, and they mediated. And here's the settlement. Remember, these people are not educated. So the example of the settlement, the man had to pay a hefty sum of money, of pigs and money, to the wife's kin. First, the defendant did not pay bride wealth as in custom. Secondly, the defendant beat up the deceased using force that was unreasonable. Thirdly, he destroyed her personal belongings and effects, a strong taboo in Enga tradition. Finally, when she was alive and her firstborn died, the defendant did not pay any compensation to maternal kin. In Enga, women were respected and are beginning to respect it even more in the communities. This was a strongly male-dominated society. These magistrates felt this change. Enga are emotional people. We express mercy, love, and affection. None of these seemed to be expressed by the defendant, and he had to pay. So if we're talking about universal human rights, what more could you want? So the point I want to make here is that many traditional cultures have existing strengths, and that we should draw on their existing strengths rather than exerting our strength on them. Do I have time to go on to global warming? Yeah, okay. I've got 5, that's perfect. Okay, so where am I here? Gotta find my place. Okay, and then, no, I'm not in the right place here. Let's see, okay. So I want to talk about, also this is one more slide. Church movements are also supporting peace. So it's the local courts and the church movements which have brought about this incredible end to war. Settlement. Okay, so indigenous society and environmental impact. Often there's a debate. Do traditional societies, are they natural stewards of the environment? Do they take care of it? And are we destroying it? The answer is absolutely no. What happens is that exploitation of the environment is limited by the social system. Because if you produce too much of a surplus, you share it. So you produce enough for your family, your kin group, and to gain a bit more status. And if you produce more, you're just considered stupid because you're producing it to give away. And so there is a limit on the incentives to production. And here are people, this is a pandanus feast of pandanus nuts, and everybody has arrived, and the surplus is being shared. So, and in the events where things are being shared, people get an enormous amount of social satisfaction. People fill up in ways that do not require the 4.5 planets that we have been talking about, that if we would need to support the entire world at our standard of living. So my takeaway point here is it's really time for us to stop telling them how to fill up with our ways and our products, but to draw on their existing strengths and maybe even rethink our own ways of doing so. And so now very quickly you will ask me, how can we do this? Well, there are examples now. The number one best way to alleviate poverty and draw on existing strengths that I know are the pension programs in Botswana and Namibia. All people over the age of 60 get a monthly pension from the government, and this goes to the grandparents, of course, and the grandparents are the ones who know the tradition and the ones who have lived through all the change, so they know what's up. And they take that money and give it to they never keep it for themselves. They give it to their kids and their grandkids in such a way as to keep the existing strengths of society moving on. A second NGO project, the best I know, is by a fellow, Mac Chapin, who we tried to get to come here, but he's in Asia right now. And he has developed, he's an anthropologist, and he's developed a mapping company. And he will go into middle of Brazil, where there's nothing on the map, and get a group of people, and then he gets them in very naive drawings to draw out who owns every tree, where the resources are, what's of value. Then he brings in the cartographers who work with the people. They put these into formal maps, and they put them into the National Archives. So when the logging company, the mining company comes in and says, we want to develop here, the government says, oh, there's nothing there, look at this empty map, and then whoops, all these maps of ownership are already in the archives. That is a real way two ways to really let the people speak are, one, things like old age pensions, where the top of society distributes the wealth, and projects like MAC, where rights are given to every individual and not the usual people who represent their groups and sell out for their own economic gain. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to shut it. Well, good afternoon. You're all very brave to stick with us late into a Friday afternoon, and I'm very pleased to, in fact, to be the cleanup hitter today. This has been a very stimulating conference. I've heard a lot of things that I found very superb, and I found some things also very disappointing in some of the presentations I heard. But even when I felt people were wrong, they were instructively wrong, and I certainly learned a great deal. I thought what I would do is try to take the topic today a little bit more head-on. I'm going to change a couple of things just to suit my own contributions. When I was first confronted by the notion of speaking about the common good, my first response is I know nothing about the common good. But I do know a little bit about a concept that I've been playing around with in my work that I'll refer to as comparative harm. And I think comparative harm has some relationship to the common good, the notion being a bit more modest, that one of our more modest intents should be to reduce individual harms and overall harms, and if we do that, by its nature, we have contributed to the common good. But what I thought I would also talk about a bit in context is the crisis of law and globalization. We have still left something of an open question. What is the crisis? I heard Professor Falk talk about climate change. I heard yesterday us talk about the economic crisis. I think those are two very, very different types of crises. I'm an expert in neither. So I'd like to talk about the crisis that I know a little bit about, which is the crisis of law and globalization. And then I'd like to relate that a bit to my own work that I think echoes the presentations you've heard today from DeVon and Polly, because I think one of the unique things about the University of Utah and a lot of our international work, certainly not all of our international work, is this very strong commitment to local engagement, to capacity building, to neutral inquiry that avoids a lot of the hazards of the typical conventional foreign aid imposition of values model, and I can certainly would like to get into that a little bit as we go along. So first, to mention without dwelling on it, that law obviously enables globalization. I mean, if globalization is the intensification of cross-border exchange of information, goods, services, then certainly it is the law that at least permits that intensification to take place. I should also mention that when we talk about globalization, our tendency is to talk about it in this kind of transactional sense that we heard yesterday. I should also mention that globalization includes the cross-border intensification or transfer of harms as well as goods. So think for just a moment about things that cross borders, whether through the environment or through social agencies such as violence, political violence, called terrorism, that also our global legal system in a way permits. But I'm not going to dwell on that. What I'd really like to talk about is the challenge that globalization poses for law. And there are two different types of crises that I'm very concerned with. The first is what I would call the institutional crisis of globalization on domestic systems. If we just pause for a moment over the last 30 years, globalization itself has been a means of distributing and reinforcing notions of democracy, limited government, human rights, on the one hand, as well as private transactions economies and notions of limited government in the economy on the other. And both of these ideas have put tremendous strain on court systems. You can observe 5, 6 really severe problems that certainly pre-existed the last 30 years, but have been become very, very acute. When you provide rights against a governmental power, to execute those rights or enforce those rights, people have to actually ask the court system to enforce the rights. That puts tremendous pressure on the court system. If you never have those rights at all, the court system never hears those claims. If Joel and I have a contract together and we have a dispute, and our economy is based on that private contracting, someone's got to resolve that dispute. And in most societies, the institution that we primarily give that authority to is a court system. And liberalization of the economy and so forth has shown a tremendous rise in filings. And at the same time, we haven't made concomitant investments in the court systems to handle those increasingly daunting levels of claims. So you see delay and backlog as a kind of natural consequence in India, which I'll talk about later, just to give you some idea. And I didn't bring a lot of hard data with me, but I could certainly supply it. In a typical urban, even medium-sized urban area, to get to trial can be easily 15 years. And that's just a trial, and then because of very liberal procedural rights, you can get appeals of various elements of the case going through the court system for years to come. And it has produced a backlog that's now estimated at 29 million suits. There's an estimate that to resolve all of this backlog at current capacity would take about 124 years, okay, just to describe that problem. The second is, as the courts become more important as a protection against governmental excess, as an enforcer of private contracting, they become more vulnerable to corruption. So because what they're doing becomes more meaningful, then the incentives for influencing them with bribes becomes more attractive. Third, there's more of an incentive to politically interfere with courts, so judicial independence becomes at further risk. If the political actors don't really care what the courts are doing, no reason to interfere. If all of a sudden a court can void a law or bankrupt a powerful family business, all of a sudden the politicians and the political powers of that society want to get involved. And not to mention that globalization also poses a major problem for judicial independence, because if I have a transnational dispute, the court system usually belongs to one country or the other, and by its very assignment as an organ of that particular state resolving the dispute cannot be, in the truest political sense, ever independent. And then on the criminal justice side, I think you can also see that liberalization, particularly of authoritarian regimes and state or police states, often leads to a lot more criminal activity. That's just a very common trend. And if a court system can't handle all of that criminal activity, people end up sitting in detention for very long periods of time. This is a very devastating human rights problem. In India, just to use India again as one example, they call it the problem of undertrial. And throughout major parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, there are more people sitting incarcerated for longer periods of time without a trial than they would have served if they'd been convicted on the first day of their arrest and served a full term. So our civilization is in some way warehousing those accused without trial for longer periods of time than they would serve a full sentence if convicted. And finally, because a lot of systems don't have good forensic technology, and I don't mean just DNA, I'm talking about fingerprinting, good interrogation techniques that don't rely on physical abuse and coercion. The amount of coercion, I should say that confessions become the primary forensic method for proving guilt, and therefore the incentives for physical and psychological coercion. And this goes well before 9/11 and the sort of realization of what's been done in some of the high security contexts. This is at a very pedestrian level of criminal activity. So there is this crisis that court systems are confronting, and I think it's very severe, and I don't think we're spending anywhere near the amount of attention to it. And I should add that if any of these global projects are to be successful, they can't be successful only at a global level. It's a rather obvious comment, but I often feel in conversations like this, we lose complete sight of what's going on in the fields or on the streets. And without solutions that we can bring down to that field or street level, I don't think we're having much of an effect at all. We live in this parallel universe of global concepts and responsibilities and rights. And without the processes to realize and effectuate the underlying normative commitments that we have, I don't think we're doing very much good. The second kind of crisis that I might mention, and this is going to be along the lines perhaps of Tony's articulation of a stylized way of explaining it, is what I would call the conflict of laws that occurs from the process of globalization. Okay? And I'm going to model this in a very simplistic way so that we all kind of retain the basic contours of the way that our civilization deals with a fundamental problem. The fundamental problem has two elements. The fact that we have difference. So in this case, let's posit that we have two polities, polity A and B. This could be two states, it could be two families, two individuals who have different normative values. And that's fine because if we live in a parallel universe in a Euclidean sense in which we never interact, you can do whatever you want and I don't care as long as I can do whatever I want. The second element is interaction. And so in the context of globalization, what we're talking about is we have this global legal system set up where national systems have their own legal systems and their own rights to legislate in the way they want. And now we have cross-border activity, and all of a sudden the question is, if I'm a Greek in Rome, what normative structure governs my activity? So the way I like to best explain this is in very, very basic social terms. When I moved to Cleveland from New York, my daughter was just a little toddler, and we did not allow her to eat candy. And the Reikovich family across the street became very, very good friends of ours. Their kids ate candy all the time. So we have two polities, the Chodoshes and the Reikoviches, one with an anti-candy normative system and the other with a pro-candy liberal system. And that would be fine if we never interacted. But all of a sudden, when my little Sager wants to go across the street, I've got a conflict of laws. And our civilization has many strategies to deal with this. What are they? Well, let's go back to Tony. I could just take the Reikoviches over and possess their property and Columbus-like, by fiat, declare ownership. I suppose that's one strategy. But in most modern times, we would first maybe set up a border. We'd say, Sage, you may not cross the street. You may not interact. Do we use that strategy? Yes, we use it sparingly. It's very costly. Trading with the Enemy Act. Can't do business with Cuba, can't do business with Iran. Can't sell dual-use technology to China. Costly, why? Because we're limiting that natural liberal set of transactions, but in severe cases where the harms are greater than the goods, we put up that barrier. We can use choice of law strategies. So I can say to Sage, well, We believe in a territorial choice of law approach. So when in Rome, do as the Romans do. When you're in Reykjavik land, you may eat as much candy as you like. When you come home, we'll brush your teeth or whatever it is that we care about. We use comparative reform. In this case, I might say, gosh, the Reykjaviks have a very liberal regime. Maybe we're being too restrictive. We open ourselves up to maybe allowing Seja to eat candy 1 day a week. That seems like a great reform. The Reykjaviks look at us and they say, oh my God, our kids are a pain and they're always after us for candy. Let's be a little bit more like the Chodoshes. Let's also adopt their one candy rule. There's no agreement between the families. This just happens through their interaction. In our case, we discovered that the Reykjaviks' candy day was on Saturday and ours was on Friday. And so the kids were arbitraging 2 days a week instead of just one. And so what did we need at that point? Fourth strategy, a treaty to agree that Saturday shall be the candy day. And of course, that's not the end of the story because that presumes perfect enforcement, which we know we can't presume. And where there's noncompliance, we need a third party to step in. That's a local sheriff or a county court to actually enforce the rules. Because who do you think enforced this rule better? I did, because I was coming at it from a more repressive normative position than my friends across the street who were more liberal, okay? So now, if we go back to choice of law, there's a very interesting approach to choice of law that was developed called comparative harm. It's a very simple idea. The court is to weigh the harm to state B of the application of A's law against the harm to state A of the application of B's law. So in my case, I would weigh the harm to the Reykjaviks of imposing the anti-candy rule on them when Seja's in their presence. And I would then weigh that against the harm to me of Seja's consuming candy in this foreign territory, okay? Now, here's the problem with comparative harm in a choice of law context. And this goes to Richard's comment yesterday, which I think gets at this sense of looking at these kind of harms that are imposed. And at one point in your talk, you said something like, but of course that has to be done impartially. Well, here's the problem. The court of A can't be expected to impartially weigh the harms of B. I mean, Joel, I know your shoe may pinch your foot, but I don't know how bad that is. And I don't know how much you care about it. And so, I mean, I'm kind of not so favorable to this notion of false consciousness because I think most consciousness is true for the people who have it. And I'm going to take that at face value. And now if I can get through that institutional problem by actually having a discussion with Joel about what those comparative harms are, I articulate my harm, you articulate your harm, and now we agree to a basic principle that we're going to try to resolve this by choosing that harm which is lesser. But it's going to be more out of a negotiation between the two of us, or it may be even an internalized sense that I don't want to impose my harm on you because I've made that determination in advance, so I'm going to be very gracious. Or we may need facilitation, mediation, and this is where mediation comes in, to actually help us through that process where we can agree. And at least theoretically, if we can internalize that notion of comparative harm in our lives, in our families, in our social communities, in our states, in our countries, and in our globe, we can actually reduce the overall harm by absorbing the lesser harm when it's appropriate to do so, okay? So let me give you now, and this sort of is a nice little echo from Polly's presentation, is if I believe in this notion of comparative harm and I believe in mediation, how do we embed it? How do we spread it? How do we disseminate it? How do we get it internalized? And I learned long ago from a quote attributed to Jean Monnet that every new idea is a bad idea until it has an institution. So here's the institution. Mediation is the institution. Mediation just facilitated negotiation, the neutralizing communication techniques as well as the bargaining techniques. And now let me go back to India just briefly. When I started with mediation reform in India I'd say from 96 to 2003, there was a big problem, which was the way that Americans, Australians, Germans would talk about mediation in India was as a system that was just wholly out of their own social situation. And there was always this pressing question for me after those presentations as what would you do on Monday? And there was never really a powerful answer to that. So what I did in 2003 is I came up with this idea of disaggregating all of the tools that go into mediation, just taking them apart. It's like a recipe that you just pull out all the ingredients. And then you present the ingredients and say, each ingredient has its own nutritional or social value. Can I find analogs for the use of this ingredient, again, the pre-existing strengths or the existing strengths of the society and its social capacity? And that one act, that one pivot opened up tremendously opportunities to find analogs for these social processes. I'll give one and then a quick story and then conclude. So most people who study mediation would say one of the primary communication tools or necessities for mediation or precondition is joint communication. If I don't have joint communication, I can't mediate. So I was giving a little mini training program on this one element, and an Indian lawyer said to me, I'm understanding what you're saying. I said, I am practicing that all the time. I said, well, tell me about it. He says, well, tells a story about this couple. He says the couple was not talking to one another. The fellow had decided to donate a kidney. His wife was very upset with him, not for the donation, but for not conferring with her in advance. And things had gotten bad and they weren't talking. I said, well, so what did you do? He says, I invited them to my parlor, offered them tea, and I shut the door. And I said, what happened then? He said, well, first hour, silence. Second hour, screaming. Third hour, talking. And they came out and they'd resolved their differences. And that's a very crude form of mediation, right? I mean, no one at Harvard would think this was in like the Harvard Mediation Project manual. But he had established joint communication, okay? So it's that kind of adaptation. So let me just jump way ahead to the story of what's happening today. Delhi High Court resolving 125 cases a day. There's a young mediator in the Delhi High Court by the name of Mr. Sood. Mr. Sood has a typical dispute come before him, two brothers. Elder brother and a much younger brother. The brothers, their father died at an early age. The elder brother had to take care of the farm. This is a typical pattern. The younger brother was raised as a pup, almost as his own child. Developed, as he grew older, a sense of entitlement, got a little spoiled, started to make claims on the resources coming out of the farm. The older brother felt the younger one never respected him, was spoiled, conflict ensued, they stopped talking, wouldn't even acknowledge each other. So here's young advocate Sood sitting in a mediation center in New Delhi High Court. He's got these two brothers, their backs are turned to one another. What to do? There's nothing in the Harvard manual on this. So he thinks, he says, it is a custom of this court by high order that the younger must go to the elder and touch his feet as a sign of respect. The younger brother says, no way. There's no way I'm going to do that. So then Sood has a brilliant idea. He says, because I am the younger of your elder brother, I too must comply with this order. And he goes over and he touches the elder brother's feet. At that point, the younger brother has no possibility of getting out. Because if he doesn't also do it, he offends the mediator and the court, and it's a social catastrophe. He goes to the elder brother, touches his feet. The elder brother immediately breaks into weeping. Take it, take everything. And the mediator has to settle them down. But the elder brother said, all I ever wanted was your respect. And so a completely unexpected technique drawing on a social practice with a very clever way of establishing joint communication gets internalized, adapted, formalized back as part and disseminated back out as part of the regular way of thinking about how to establish joint communication, empowers other types of similarly creative techniques, and builds from the ground up a capacity for mediating the very pedestrian disputes that if we can't mediate the very pedestrian disputes, I don't know how in the history of our civilization we will ever mediate the kind of crises that you're attentive to, climate change, the financial crisis, war, etc. And I think for that reason, I just want to dedicate my comments today to Mr. Suit and to the two brothers. So thank you very much for listening.
That was wonderful. I want to thank the panelists for their presentations. It gave a lot of texture to our conversation. Do you want to join us? And I guess we have about 10 minutes or so. Dean, does that sound about right, Tom? Yeah, about 10 minutes or so. So the microphones are open.
I have a question, probably aimed mostly at Hiram. For those of you who do not know, there is a town here in Utah called Virgin. It's down in southern Utah. Virgin, the town council passed a law declaring Virgin, Utah a UN-free zone. They are very worried about a super sovereign post-Westphalian global order taking hold and eroding what they perceive to be their rights. So within the context of this conference, we've talked about global crises on many different levels. What is the possibility that these problems can be resolved at a sovereign nation state level, or do we need the very type of post-Westphalian government that the people of Virgin, Utah fear?
There's a question in
Is that, let me come at this a little bit differently than you might imagine, but let's just think about this a little bit. First of all, we have these tensions throughout our society. I mean, the states' rights movement reflects these kinds of tensions. Anytime a local community wants to assert its own ability, its own autonomy, its own ability to control its destiny, those ideas of self-determination are always in tension with any sort of supra-regulatory body that has some level of control over it. We experience this on an individual level, on a family level, whatever the social institutional setting is. I think that when townships like Virgin or any other subset of society make such a stark statement, I think we have to first really listen to it. I think we have to really take it almost on face value. And we have to actually ask, well, what is it that is so threatening? I mean, let's actually break this down. You know, in what way is the UN threatening your ability to do the things that you feel are in your interest? Or is this just some sort of ideological, red herring? But then what we have to do is we have to describe and educate a community like this that this notion of sovereignty can actually be expanded through various vertical forms of collaboration and cooperation. And here's the way I would model that for you. If, say there were 3 states in this room, and I'm going to call them A, B, and C, and I came to you and I said, there are certain problems between the 3 of you that you share. And so in order to really work on those problems, we're going to have to elevate to a supra-community level of control. And you're going to look at that from your own point of view, and you're going to see that as a loss of sovereignty because you're giving up some authority to this unit. What I would also point out to them is that also they're expanding their sovereignty because by virtue of your participation now in this larger enterprise, you have the ability to influence what's going on in C in a way that you can't now do. And you can influence it for good. And this is the whole logic of our federalist system. It's not just to protect the states. It's to have the states actually influence what goes on in DC. At least that's in theory. I know things get out of balance and out of whack. But I think that our first response to that kind of thing should be primarily an educational approach and a really engaging approach to see what it is that's at stake. And then to say, okay, if we have an organization like the UN with these limited responsibilities, and we have your locale with its limited responsibilities, where are you concerned and where are the harms? Is it just the idea of the UN, or is the UN doing something in your town to mess with your lives? And until I get a really concrete answer to the latter, then I'm not really sure how seriously to treat such a claim.
I have, well, a different response, but I bet that Hiram and I agree in the end. One similarity is I have some sympathies with the majority of the people of Virgin. I think world government would be a terrible idea, that the center would be even farther removed from the reach of public opinion than national governments are now. I think a qualitative strengthening of the UN is a bad idea. Either it will be an instrument by which great powers are able to do more to work their will on weaker countries, or if it succeeds without giving that prerogative to great powers, they'll just desert the UN. It won't provide its real function, which is a place that's automatically there for the great powers to make deals with one another. So, on the basis of that partial agreement, what should one say about underlying fears of loss of local autonomy? And I think there's no one thing to say. One thing that you can sometimes say about the way the world works is there should be more local autonomy. It seems to me that the one-size-fits-all recipe for development that's been imposed, different recipes at different times by the World Bank and the IMF, was a terrible idea. Their things should be more local, and I think what's been said, for example, about how you really improve the rule of law has been a case for that localization. In other cases, there are inherently global problems that are going to only induce the cooperation that's needed on the basis of trust that depends on shared terms for those problems. And I think a greenhouse gas emissions regime is a case in point. So I think you have to proceed problem by problem. You have to do justice to what's right in the desire to have control on the part of people whose lives are going to be affected by the decisions. And if there's a problem area in which people won't give enough to deal fairly with a problem, you have to make a case that in that particular area, they're being unfair and selfish. That's not what's involved in being too resistant to, what's involved in being too resistant to a global solution isn't that global is always better, but sometimes there's a solution to a pressing problem that can't be fair unless it involves a global regime.
Next question.
I'm Steve Bannister in the Department of Economics here. This is primarily directed toward Professor Merrill. I'm in sympathy with I was at your talk yesterday. I'm in sympathy with your views and your vision, but I have a nagging concern, I guess. And let me see if I can frame the question this way. Would you hypothesize, let's see, a level of geopolitical risk that is less in the case of a decline in U.S. hegemonic power at a less level than the realized risk that we saw the last time there was a decline? Last time, the decline of Britain as a hegemonic power, which of course in some ways led to a century of war, depression, et cetera.
One hopes so. Clearly, great powers have learned something from two world wars, that's, we tend to forget it, but think about it. War between France and Germany is now unimaginable. And I think that's partly a lesson learned by the horrors of the wars that were. The fact that nuclear weapons would be used in the case of a direct confrontation does of course, give nations pause, and the depth of mutual involvement economically gives a nation's pause. So that's less. On the other hand, when spheres of influence of one world power are defended against incursions by another, we know from the last period of tension, which was a Cold War, as far as the superpowers themselves, the US and the Soviet Union, was concerned, we know that proxy wars are a real and rational possibility. We know that insurgencies can be sponsored in devastating ways, that civil disorder can be induced in contested territories in ways that lead to millions of excess deaths. So if the comparison is with the decline of Britain, well, who knows, even if you're a philosopher, but I think you may well be right that the risks are less, certainly of direct conflict, but I think that indirect conflict can reach a terrible toll, and of course the tiny, tiny possibility of direct conflict, that's a transcendental horror. Does that make sense in terms of levels of fear?
I may sleep better tonight, I don't know.
Okay, I hope so.
But I still have a nagging concern.
Yes.
It was a terrible century in some respects. Thank you.
Well, I think it's important to respect your time and to respect the schedule, so I have two more things I need to do. First, I want to thank the panelists. I thought these were just spectacular presentations. Brilliant. And want to thank you all as well. And finally, I just want to recognize Tom Maloney, who's going to give the benediction, I guess, right? Okay, thanks.
I need a can of Coke for that.
The Holy Spirit.
That's right. I just wanted to say, the Tanner Center conferences, I think, are pretty ambitious conferences, and I don't say that just to sort of toot our own horn. I say it because I think it's true. We're asking experts who work on very challenging, sometimes very technical problems to communicate their insights across disciplines and to the broader community, and that's a hard thing to do. We do this in the hope that this wider communication, as challenging as it is, can spark new ideas and collaborations and discoveries, and maybe also move toward new solutions to hard problems. But it is hard work. If you're like me, you're a little bit tired, but it's a good kind of tired, I think. So I want to thank the presenters for their engaging in this hard work, and also the audience for engaging in this hard work and this attention over several days. So thanks to you. This collaboration can continue, so let me just mention a couple things that you can look for. On the back of the brochure, you'll find our web address for the Human Rights Center. We also have a Facebook page, which you can link to from there. You'll find there videos and summaries of all our past conferences. We'll have videos of all of these proceedings up within a couple of weeks. And we will be adding other resources there, including things like reading lists on the topics that have been covered at this conference for those of you who want to dig into these things a little bit deeper. We also help to promote events in the community that relate to human rights and peace building. You can find announcements there as well, and if you have things you'd like us to help you promote, you can send us email there. And you'll also find there some information about the center's library. We have a small library in Orson Spencer Hall, which has a collection of books and films and other materials on human rights issues, things related to our specific conferences and other issues that are sort of germane to human rights and peace building. That's a set of resources that's available to the community. So we invite you to take a look at that and contact us about that. And eventually you'll find there information about our programs and themes for next year. So we'd encourage you to keep an eye on that. Let me ask you maybe to do one other thing. There are brochures on a table in the back still, I think. They're still there? Okay. And inside, there are some feedback forms. So if you have any advice, anything you want to say thanks for, any advice you want to give us in terms of our planning, we'd appreciate it if you could fill those out. So thanks again. I want to thank the Tanner family again. Thank all of our partners and sponsors. Wish safe travel to all our many visitors. And we hope to see many of you back here again next year. Thanks.